start here. Not with kings or crowns or the tidy sentence that opens every textbook. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22nd, 1485, but with a body. Strip the armor off him first, because that's what they did. Piece by piece, in front of everyone, on the field where he'd fallen. A gold circlet, the crown itself, or something close enough to it, is found wedged under a hawthorn bush, knocked loose from his helmet in the final scramble, and someone picks it up and hands it, almost casually, to the man who is now king. There is no ceremony to this moment. No trumpets. Just soldiers stripping a corpse for its metal, the way soldiers had done to corpses for 1,000 years before this one, and would do for centuries after. Then they put him on a horse, not sitting on it, the way a king rides, slung over it, the way you carry meat home from a hunt. His head hangs on one side, his legs on the other. And whoever is arranging this, and someone is arranging this deliberately because this is a message being sent to an entire kingdom, has made sure that his skull knocks against a stone bridge parapet on the way into town. There's a story that a local woman, decades later, would point to a crack in that very stone and say, "That's where the last Plantagenet king cracked his head open, riding into Leicester dead." He is 32 years old. 900 years of English kingship, stretching back through Normans and Saxons, has just ended in a marsh in about 2 hours. And nobody watching that morning could have told you with any confidence how it was going to end. That's the story this video wants to tell you, not what happened in the flat, encyclopedia sense. You can get that from a paragraph. The story of how a kingdom changes hands in an afternoon, and why the people standing in that field, on both sides, had absolutely no idea which way it would break until the very last minutes. Because here is the truth that gets smoothed out of most tellings of Bosworth. This was not a foregone conclusion. This was not history's machinery grinding toward an inevitable outcome. This was a coin spinning in the air, and it landed on its edge more than once before it finally fell. The central question worth carrying through everything that follows is this: how does a king with the bigger army, the better ground, and the stronger claim to the throne lose everything, while an exile with a shaky bloodline and a few thousand tired men becomes the founder of one of history's most famous dynasties? The answer isn't luck exactly. It isn't fate. It's something more unsettling than either of those. It's betrayal, arriving at exactly the moment it would do the most damage. From the one family that both sides had spent months trying to buy. To understand how we got to that man in the mud, we have to go back, not decades, but generations, to a family so large, so tangled, and so hungry for the same throne that they eventually ran out of any way to settle it except by killing each other. Here's a useful way to think about the Wars of the Roses. Because Wars of the Roses sounds almost pretty, almost gentle. Flowers, not blood. It wasn't a war between two nations. It wasn't a war between strangers. It was a war between cousins. Second cousins, in some cases. People who had eaten at the same tables, danced at the same weddings, prayed in the same chapels, and who, when it came down to it, were willing to have each other's heads mounted on spikes over city gates. All of it traced back to one king who had entirely too many sons. Edward III, who ruled England in the 1300s, had 5 sons who survived into adulthood. And in the medieval world, that was a problem waiting to happen, not a blessing. Each of those sons founded a line. Each of those lines produced descendants who, 100 years later, could point to their great-great-grandfather and say, "My blood is as royal as yours, maybe more so." 2 of those lines, in particular, curdled into rivals. The House of Lancaster, whose badge was a red rose, and the House of York, whose badge was a white one. The names sound almost decorative now, the kind of thing you'd put on a wine label. At the time, wearing the wrong rose in the wrong town could get you killed. For decades, the two houses had traded the crown back and forth like a hot coal neither of them could hold on to for long. Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, was pious, well-meaning, and by most accounts, spectacularly unsuited to actually running a country. Prone to breakdowns, easily led, and married to a wife, Margaret of Anjou, who had roughly 10 times his political instincts and none of his hesitation. The Yorkists eventually pushed him off the throne entirely. Edward IV, Duke of York, took the crown, lost it briefly, and took it back again through sheer battlefield ruthlessness. By the early 1470s, it looked finally like the fighting might be over. Edward IV sat comfortably on the throne. He had sons, actual sons, healthy ones, the kind of dynastic insurance a medieval king prayed for every night of his life. And then, in April 1483, Edward IV did the one thing no amount of political skill can prevent. He died. Not violently, not on a battlefield. Just died at 40. Probably from a combination of illness and the kind of self-indulgence available to a king who thought he'd already won. And the moment he did, everything he had spent 12 years stabilizing came apart in a matter of weeks. Because here is the second thing you need to understand about medieval kingship. And it's the thing that makes everything at Bosworth 2 years later make sense. A child on the throne is an invitation. Edward IV's heir, the new Edward V, was 12 years old. 12-year-old kings do not rule. Someone rules for them in their name. And whoever that someone is has effectively won the game without a single vote being cast. The only question was going to be who. The man who answered that question was the dead king's own brother. And the way he answered it would poison his name for 500 years. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had spent his whole adult life being useful to his brother. He was a capable soldier, a competent administrator, loyal, by the standards of a family that had spent 30 years betraying each other, genuinely, notably loyal. When Edward IV died, Richard was named Lord Protector, guardian of the young king, and regent of the realm until Edward V came of age. It was, on paper, exactly the role a trusted uncle should play. It is also, if you are an ambitious man standing one step from a throne occupied by a child, an almost unbearable temptation. And within a few months, Richard stopped resisting it. The details of what happened next are still argued over by historians who have spent entire careers on nothing else. But the shape of the story is not in serious dispute. Richard intercepted the young king en route to London and took custody of him. He arrested and executed several of the boy's Woodville relatives, the family of Edward IV's widow, who had their own ambitions to control the regency. Then, in June 1483, a priest stood up in front of an assembly and declared that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid all along, which meant his children, including the boy currently sitting in the Tower of London waiting to be crowned, were illegitimate. Bastards can't inherit a throne, which meant, conveniently, the throne was empty, which meant the closest legitimate adult male heir was Richard. He took the crown within days. He was crowned Richard III on the 6th of July, 1483. And then the two boys, Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9, simply vanished from the historical record. They had been placed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their own safety and comfort ahead of the coronation that never came. They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens that summer, and then they were not seen again, ever, by anyone. No bodies were produced, no explanation was given, no funeral was held. Sit with that for a second, because it's the hinge on which the rest of this story turns. We still don't know, with total certainty, what happened to the princes in the Tower. Historians have spent 5 centuries building cases for Richard's guilt, for other suspects entirely, for accident, for cover-up. What we know is simpler and, in some ways, more damning. 2 children who stood between Richard and the throne disappeared while in his custody, and he never once, in the 2 years he had left to live, produced them alive to silence the rumors. A man with nothing to hide had every incentive to end the speculation. He never did. Whether or not Richard III personally ordered their deaths, and reasonable historians still disagree, the political effect was identical either way. England now had a king who had climbed to power over the disappearance of 2 children, and who could not, or would not, prove otherwise. Trust, once, is hard enough to rebuild. Trust in a king who might have murdered his own nephews for their crown was never coming back. Which meant Richard III now had a country full of people quietly, carefully, looking around for an alternative. They found one in the unlikeliest person imaginable. A 26-year-old man who had spent almost his entire life outside England, whose claim to the throne was, by any honest legal reckoning, thin to the point of laughable, and whose only qualification, really, was that he was not Richard. If you had been asked, in 1470, to bet on which Englishman would end up founding a royal dynasty, you would not have looked twice at Henry Tudor. He wasn't hidden because he was dangerous. He was hidden because he was, for most of his childhood, an afterthought, a boy with a claim so distant and tangled that almost nobody bothered to worry about him. Here's how thin that claim actually was. Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, was a descendant of John of Gaunt, one of Edward III's many sons, but through a line that had been explicitly barred from the succession by an act of Parliament decades earlier, because the children in question had been born before their parents married. Margaret herself was remarkable. Brilliant, devout, politically shrewd in a way that would shape English history for the next half-century. But she had given birth to Henry when she was barely 13 years old, in the middle of a civil war, and his father, Edmund Tudor, had died 3 months before he was born. Henry Tudor arrived in the world an orphan in waiting, with a claim to the throne that most serious observers at the time would have ranked somewhere around 15th or 20th in line, if they'd bothered ranking it at all. He spent his childhood in Wales, raised largely by his uncle Jasper Tudor, and then, when the political winds shifted violently against the Lancastrian cause in the early 1470s, he spent his teenage years and his 20s in exile in Brittany and France, effectively a hostage in slow motion, a bargaining chip that various rulers held on to because he might be useful someday, without anyone quite believing that day would come. What changed everything wasn't Henry doing anything remarkable. What changed everything was Richard III doing something catastrophic to his own reputation. The moment the princes in the Tower vanished, every disaffected Yorkist in England, and there were more of them than Richard could afford, needed a new banner to rally behind, someone with royal blood who wasn't Richard. Henry Tudor, this obscure exile with a thin claim, suddenly looked less like a nobody and more like the only available alternative. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, worked behind the scenes with extraordinary patience and nerve to build him a coalition. Crucially, a plan took shape. Henry would marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of the dead King Edward IV, and sister to the vanished princes, uniting Lancaster and York in a single marriage and making his claim not just tolerable to Yorkists, but actively appealing to them. Suddenly, this wasn't Lancaster versus York anymore. It was everyone who distrusted Richard versus Richard. Henry tried to invade in 1483, and it fell apart before it really began. His ships were scattered by storms. His main ally in England, the Duke of Buckingham, was captured and executed before Henry even landed. And he turned back to Brittany, having accomplished nothing but proving he was willing to try. It would have been entirely reasonable at that point for everyone involved to write Henry Tudor off as a failed pretender, one more footnote in a war that had already produced dozens of them. Instead, he spent the next 2 years doing something more dangerous than fighting. He waited, and he built. And by the summer of 1485, he judged, correctly as it turned out, though he could not have known it at the time, that the moment had come again. Stop here for a second, because this is worth feeling rather than just moving past. Picture August 1485 from 2 very different rooms. In one room, in England, sits a crowned king. Richard III has the throne, the treasury, the standing armies of a functioning kingdom, and, on paper, every material advantage a medieval ruler could ask for. What he does not have is trust. He knows that half his nobility watches him with quiet suspicion, wondering about 2 boys who vanished on his watch. He knows that the men who serve him do so out of duty or fear, not devotion, and that duty and fear are brittle things in the middle of a battle. His gamble, if you can call it that, is simply this: hold the throne long enough, rule competently enough, and the suspicion will fade, and the crown will feel normal on his head instead of stolen. In the other room, in Brittany, sits a man who has never held any English office, never commanded an English army, and has spent more of his adult life running from danger than facing it. Henry Tudor's gamble is almost absurd in its audacity. Cross the sea with a few thousand men, march into a hostile kingdom, and convince enough Englishmen along the way that a Welsh-raised exile with a barely defensible bloodline deserves their loyalty more than their anointed crowned king does. If he's wrong, there is no second chance. There is no retreat to Brittany this time, no regrouping for another attempt in 2 years. Losing at Bosworth means dying at Bosworth, or dying shortly after in whatever grim way Richard chose to make an example of him. Everything that follows, the landing, the march, the maneuvering, the battle itself, needs to be understood with that asymmetry in mind. Richard is playing to hold what he has. Henry is playing because he has nothing left to lose by playing. And it's worth remembering, as this story moves forward, that men who have nothing left to lose tend to attract exactly the kind of desperate, opportunistic allies who make the difference in moments like this one. Allies like a certain family that had spent years perfecting the art of betting on both sides of every fight. We'll meet that family properly soon. First, the invasion. On the 7th of August, 1485, Henry Tudor's small fleet came ashore at Mill Bay, near Dale in Pembrokeshire, on the southwestern coast of Wales. It's worth pausing on how small this actually was. Historians estimate his invading force at somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 men. A mix of English and Welsh exiles who had stuck with him through years of waiting, and French mercenaries whose loyalty extended exactly as far as their pay. This was not an army capable of conquering a kingdom by force. If Richard III had met Henry on the beach with his full royal army, this story ends in a single afternoon and nobody remembers Henry Tudor's name at all. But Henry hadn't come to fight his way across England. He'd come to grow his way across it. Wales mattered because Henry's own bloodline ran through it. His grandfather, Owen Tudor, had been Welsh, and Henry had spent his early childhood there under his uncle Jasper's protection. To the Welsh, Henry wasn't some foreign pretender. He was, in a real sense, one of their own. A Welshman with a shot at the English throne. And that mattered enormously in a region that had spent centuries feeling politically sidelined by London. As Henry's small column moved inland, through Haverfordwest, up through Cardigan, toward Machynlleth and Shrewsbury, Welsh gentry and their retainers began falling in alongside him. Every day of the march, in theory, made his army bigger and Richard's job harder. It also made his army slower, more visible, and more vulnerable, because the entire time Henry was gathering strength in the west, messengers were riding hard toward Richard III with the news that the invasion everyone had half expected all summer had finally arrived. Whatever else history has to say about Richard III, it cannot say he was slow to react. The moment word reached him that Henry Tudor had landed, Richard began mobilizing with the kind of speed that suggests a man who had been dreading and half expecting this exact moment for 2 years. He was at Nottingham Castle, chosen deliberately as a central staging point from which he could respond quickly to a threat from almost any direction. And he issued the calls to arms that any English king could issue, to his loyal nobles, to the sheriffs of the counties, to anyone who owed him military service under the feudal obligations that still, in 1485, governed how English wars got fought. The response, on paper, was overwhelming. Richard assembled an army that most historians place somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men, 2 to 3 times the size of anything Henry could field, even after weeks of Welsh recruitment. He had artillery. He had experienced captains. He had, crucially, the legal and moral authority of the crowned, anointed King of England, which in the medieval world was not nothing. Plenty of men who had no particular love for Richard personally would still show up to defend the institution of kingship against a foreign-backed pretender, because the alternative, chaos and civil war without end, was worse for everyone. But numbers on a muster roll are not the same as loyalty on a battlefield. And this is where the story starts to tighten around its real subject. Because sitting quietly among the nobles Richard summoned, required to come under threat of treason charges if they refused, was a family that had spent the entire Wars of the Roses perfecting a single, ruthless skill, never fully committing to anyone until the last possible moment. Meet the Stanleys. Thomas, Lord Stanley, and his younger brother William were by 1485 among the most powerful landowners in England, controlling vast estates across Cheshire and Lancashire and commanding, between them, a private military force that could plausibly swing an entire battle in either direction. They were also, by long habit, professional fence-sitters, and not out of cowardice, but out of a very cold, very effective political philosophy. Survive first, choose sides last, and always leave yourself room to have been on the winning team. Here's the detail that makes this family genuinely fascinating, rather than just tactically important. Thomas Stanley was Henry Tudor's own stepfather. He had married Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, years earlier, which meant that the most powerful uncommitted nobleman in England was, quite literally, family to the man trying to overthrow the king. And Richard III knew it, which is precisely why, as Henry's invasion unfolded, Richard demanded that Stanley send his son, George Stanley, Lord Strange, to the royal court as a hostage. Insurance against the very real possibility that family loyalty might outweigh feudal duty when the moment came. It's worth sitting with the sheer tension of that arrangement for a second, because it tells you everything about how fragile Richard's position really was. The King of England, marching to defend his crown, had to take a nobleman's son hostage just to guarantee that nobleman would show up. And even then, he couldn't be certain which side that nobleman's army would actually fight for once the battle started. Thomas Stanley, for his part, played the situation with icy precision. He claimed illness and avoided joining Richard's main force directly, while also carefully avoiding an open declaration for Henry that would have gotten his son executed on the spot. Both armies, as they converged on the Midlands in the third week of August, understood that somewhere nearby, 6,000 Stanley soldiers were watching, waiting, and deciding. And neither Richard nor Henry could be sure, right up until the moment the fighting started, which way that decision would break. That uncertainty is the engine of everything that happens next. Keep it in mind as the two armies finally close the distance between them. By 21st August 1485, the pieces were nearly all on the board. Henry's growing army, swelled by Welsh recruits and a scattering of English defectors along the way, but still considerably smaller than the king's, had moved east through Shropshire and into the Midlands. Richard's much larger royal army marched out from Leicester to meet him. The two forces converged near the small market town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, on ground that neither commander had chosen so much as arrived at. Forced together by the geography of roads and rivers that had funneled both armies toward the same patch of English countryside. The terrain mattered, and it mattered in ways that would matter more as the day went on. This was rolling farmland cut through with boggy, marshy low ground, the kind of terrain that looks solid from a distance and swallows a horse's leg the moment you actually try to cross it. Richard, with the larger force and the luxury of arriving with more preparation time, took up a strong position on a rise historically identified as Ambayon Hill, giving his army the advantage of higher ground and a clear view of the field below. Henry's smaller force positioned itself on lower, wetter ground nearby, not by choice exactly, but because there wasn't a better option available to him. And somewhere at the margins of this converging battlefield, deliberately positioned neither fully with Richard nor fully with Henry, sat the Stanley forces, 6,000 men who had, by their very positioning, already made their intentions clear to anyone paying close attention. We have not decided yet, and we are close enough to decide quickly once we do. Night fell on 21st August, with three armies within sight of one another, none of them entirely sure what the morning would bring. Richard, according to later accounts, tales that may be embellished, but that capture something true about the atmosphere of that night, slept badly, troubled by dreams. Whether or not that detail is literally accurate, it's psychologically believable. He had every material advantage a king could ask for, and he still could not be certain. Lying in his tent that night, whether the army waiting nearby to decide would decide for him or against him. That uncertainty, not the archery, not the cavalry, not even the fighting itself, is the real story of what happened at Bosworth Field. Dawn on August 22nd, 1485 arrived, and with it, the last morning medieval England would ever see a crowned king ride out to defend his own throne with his own sword. The battle opened the way most medieval battles opened, at a distance, with noise before contact, the rattle and hiss of archery volleys arcing between the lines. Some limited early artillery fire, crude, unreliable, more useful for the psychological effect of the noise than for actual killing, and skirmishing between the forward units as each side tried to read the other's intentions before committing anything valuable. Richard held the high ground, which in almost every medieval battle is the decisive advantage. It lets an army see the enemy's movements, lets missile fire travel farther and hit harder, and forces an attacker to exhaust themselves climbing before they even reach the fighting. By every conventional rule of medieval warfare, Richard's position was the strong one. Henry, watching from lower, boggier ground with a numerically inferior force, was in the position that armies usually lose from. And Henry, for his part, did something that has been endlessly debated by historians and was almost certainly the correct, if unglamorous, decision available to him. He stayed back. He positioned himself behind his main line, delegating tactical command to his most experienced captain, the Earl of Oxford, a battle-hardened veteran of exactly this kind of Wars of the Roses combat. Henry Tudor, whatever else you want to say about him, had spent his entire life as a survivor rather than a warrior. He had no real battlefield experience, and he seems to have understood, with unusual clarity for a man his age and his position, that his job that day was not to be a hero. His job was to still be alive at the end of it. Everything else was someone else's problem to solve. Richard III made the opposite choice, and it is the choice that decided the entire day. Here is the moment worth slowing all the way down for, because everything else in this story, the family background, the invasion, the marching, the positioning, exists to set up this single decision. As the battle developed, Richard could see from his position on the high ground something that should have terrified him. The Stanley forces on the field's margins were showing signs of moving, and not obviously toward him. His own numerical advantage was starting to feel less reassuring by the minute, because an army that outnumbers its enemy 2-1 only matters if that army is actually going to fight for you when the moment comes. And Richard could no longer be entirely sure of that. Meanwhile, across the field, he could see Henry Tudor himself, the entire cause of this war, the man whose death would end the rebellion instantly and completely, sitting with a relatively small personal guard, some distance behind the main Tudor line. And Richard made a decision that historians still argue about, because it can be read two completely different ways depending on how much credit you're willing to give him. Go one way, and it's a bold gambit from an experienced soldier. If the battle is going to be decided by uncertain allies and a numbers advantage that might evaporate, then the fastest way to end the entire war is to end Henry Tudor personally, right now, before anyone else has to decide anything. Cut the head off the rebellion and the body dies with it. Move the other way, and it's the decision of a man who could feel the battle and the loyalty of his own army slipping away from him, and who chose one last, desperate throw of the dice rather than watch it happen slowly. Whichever reading you find more convincing, what Richard actually did was extraordinary by any standard. He personally led a mounted charge, gathering his household cavalry and his most elite personal troops, and drove directly across the field toward Henry Tudor's position. This was not a king directing a battle from a safe vantage point. This was the anointed King of England, in his own armor, on his own horse, physically closing the distance to try to kill his rival with his own hands. For a moment, and this is the part that gets lost when the story is told only backward from its ending, it almost worked. Richard's charge tore into the edge of Henry's bodyguard with real force. Accounts describe Richard's banner-bearer, William Brandon, cut down. Accounts describe a huge Tudor supporter named John Cheney, a giant of a man by the standards of the day, knocked from his feet in the fighting as Richard drove closer and closer to Henry's own position. For a few minutes, it is entirely possible that the Battle of Bosworth Field and the next several centuries of English history hung on whether Richard's charge could close the last few yards before someone stopped it. Someone stopped it. And the someone who stopped it is the same family this story has been circling since the beginning. William Stanley had been watching this unfold from the field's edge with his 6,000 men. And as Richard's charge committed itself fully, as the king's household cavalry drove deep into the fighting, exposed, extended, and increasingly cut off from the rest of his own larger army, Stanley made his move. He attacked, not in support of Richard, whom he had been feudally obligated to muster for, into Richard's flank in support of Henry Tudor, the man his family had spent years quietly hedging its bets toward. It is worth being precise about what this meant tactically. Richard's charge had put his best troops in an exposed position, deep in enemy territory, banking everything on reaching Henry before anything could go wrong. William Stanley's intervention was the thing going wrong, and it arrived at the single worst possible moment. The moment Richard had already committed, had already extended himself past the point of easy retreat, had already bet everything on speed and audacity succeeding before anyone could punish the risk. At nearly the same moment, Thomas Stanley, who had spent the entire lead up to the battle claiming illness, keeping his son as a hostage in Richard's camp, and refusing to fully commit to either side, finally, publicly, threw his own support behind Henry Tudor. Two brothers, 6,000 men. One decision, made at the one moment in the entire day when it would do the most damage. Everything Richard had feared through that restless night before the battle, everything the uncertainty of the Stanleys had threatened from the very start of this campaign, arrived all at once, in the middle of his own charge, with his own household troops already fully committed and exposed. This is the hinge the entire war turned on. Not superior numbers, Richard had those. Not superior position, Richard had that too. Not even superior generalship necessarily. It turned on a family that had spent years refusing to choose. Choosing at last, at the precise instant, their choice mattered more than anything else that happened that day. What followed has been told and retold for 5 centuries, and the core of it is not seriously disputed, even where the specific details blur. Richard III, his charge now collapsing under William Stanley's flank attack and increasingly isolated from the rest of his own army. An army that, watching the king's household troops get overwhelmed and seeing the Stanleys openly declare against him, was rapidly losing whatever will it had to keep fighting. Continued forward anyway. His horse was killed beneath him at some point in the fighting, according to the accounts, and Richard fought on foot, in full armor, surrounded in the final minutes of his life, by men trying to kill him and very few men left trying to save him. He came close, genuinely, remarkably close, by most reconstructions of the battle, to reaching Henry Tudor before he was finally overwhelmed and cut down. Modern archaeological analysis of Richard's actual skeleton, discovered centuries later, would eventually confirm the brutal detail that the old accounts hinted at but couldn't prove. Multiple wounds to the skull, consistent with blows delivered after his helmet had been lost or removed. The kind of injuries a man receives when he is already surrounded, already beaten, and his enemies are simply making sure of it. He was 32 years old. He had been king for a little over 2 years, and with his death, something larger than one man's life ended on that field. Organized Yorkist resistance simply evaporated. There was no rallying point left, no obvious figure to regroup around, because the entire structure of Yorkist legitimacy had been resting for 2 years on the person who had just been killed in a marsh in Leicestershire. Richard III remains, to this day, the last king of England to die in battle. A distinction that sounds almost trivial stated plainly, and is almost unbearably heavy once you understand everything that had to go wrong for one specific man, on one specific morning, for that sentence to become permanently true. The opening that started this video is the image worth returning to now, because it means something different once you know everything that led up to it. According to tradition, and this detail may be more legend than verified fact, though it has survived exactly because it feels true, Richard's crown, or a version of his battle coronet, was found after the fighting caught in the branches of a hawthorn bush, having been knocked loose from his helmet somewhere in the chaos of his final charge or his death. It was recovered from the field and, in one of the more theatrical moments medieval history has to offer, placed on the head of Henry Tudor right there on the battlefield, among the dead, before the blood had even finished drying. There was no coronation ceremony that day. No archbishop, no cathedral, no formal ritual of any kind. Just an improvised crowning in a field outside Leicester, performed for an army that had, an hour earlier, been the smaller, weaker, more desperate side of the fight, and was now suddenly the only army left standing with a legitimate claim to speak for the kingdom. Henry Tudor, a man who had spent more of his life in exile than in England, whose claim to the throne had been thin enough to be a punchline 2 years earlier, who had gambled everything on a beach landing and a family's last-minute betrayal of their own king, was now, as of that morning, Henry VII of England. Richard's corpse was stripped publicly on the battlefield, a mixture of practical looting and deliberate political theater, because a dead, humiliated former king sends a very useful message to anyone still entertaining ideas of resistance. It was then carried, slung over a horse, into Leicester, where it was put on public display for 2 days, so that anyone who doubted the new political reality could see the old one. Plainly, undeniably dead. He was eventually buried without particular ceremony at Greyfriars Church in Leicester, a burial so unmarked and so quickly forgotten by history that it would take more than 500 years and a 2012 archaeological excavation underneath what had become, by then, a city council car park to actually locate his remains again. When they were found, identified through radiocarbon dating, DNA comparison with living descendants of his family line, and the unmistakable brutal evidence of his battle wounds preserved in the bone itself. It was, in its own strange way, the final chapter of the story that began that morning at Bosworth. A king so thoroughly erased by the dynasty that replaced him that the country that had once crowned him didn't even remember exactly where they'd put him. Henry VII, meanwhile, moved with the speed of a man who understood exactly how fragile his new position was. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, having spent his entire life on the losing side of exactly this kind of dynastic calculation, that winning a battle and winning a kingdom are not the same thing. The marriage came first, and it came fast. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the sister of the vanished princes and the eldest surviving child of the old Yorkist King Edward IV, formally and symbolically merging the two warring houses in a single union. This wasn't romance, or wasn't only romance. It was, by design, the final act of a political strategy years in the making, the thing that transformed Henry from the Lancastrian claimant who beat the Yorkist king into something closer to the man who ended the war between the roses entirely. The Tudor rose, the symbol that would define the new dynasty, was deliberately designed to fuse the red of Lancaster and the white of York into a single image. Propaganda rendered as botany, a visual argument that the fighting was finally, permanently over. Because here is the uncomfortable truth Henry VII understood better than almost any king before him. His claim to the throne, by strict hereditary logic, was genuinely weak. Weaker than several other people still alive in England at the time. He hadn't inherited the crown. He had won it violently on a specific morning, because a specific family had made a specific choice at a specific moment. A throne won that way can be lost the same way, by the next ambitious claimant with the next army and the next uncertain noble family, willing to switch sides at the decisive moment. Henry spent the rest of his reign, methodically and sometimes ruthlessly, making absolutely sure that never happened to him. He used acts of attainder, legal instruments that let the crown seize the lands and titles of anyone convicted, even after the fact, of treason, to strip power from families whose loyalty he doubted. He restricted and controlled the private armies that great nobles could raise, the exact kind of forces the Stanleys had used to decide his own fate on the battlefield, precisely because he understood firsthand how dangerous that kind of private military power was in the hands of someone whose loyalty might waver at the wrong moment. He rebuilt the crown's finances, painstakingly and sometimes with a level of personal frugality that later got him a reputation for miserliness, because he understood that a king without money is a king dependent on nobles, and dependent kings get betrayed. Piece by piece, deliberately, he built the foundations of something England hadn't really had in generations. A monarchy strong enough that its survival didn't depend on which way one wealthy family decided to jump. And alongside all of that institution building, he did something else. Something quieter and in some ways more consequential for how this entire story would be remembered for the next 500 years. He made sure everyone understood exactly how bad his predecessor had been. This is the part of the story that deserves to be told honestly, because it changes how you should understand almost everything you've ever heard about Richard III before this article. The Tudor dynasty had an enormous, obvious interest in making Richard III look as monstrous as possible. Because the worse Richard looked, the more justified Henry's rebellion looked, and the more legitimate Henry's shaky claim to the throne felt by comparison. This wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. Over the decades that followed Bosworth, Tudor-era chroniclers and historians, writing always in a political environment where criticizing the dynasty that had killed its way to power was not a healthy career move, built and refined an image of Richard III as a physically deformed, morally twisted, almost cartoonishly evil usurper who had murdered his way to a throne he never deserved. That image reached its most famous, most enduring form more than a century later, in a play written by a playwright working under Henry VII's own granddaughter, Elizabeth I. A portrait so vivid, so theatrically compelling, that it has arguably done more to shape the popular understanding of Richard III than any actual historical evidence ever has. None of this means Richard III was innocent, or that the accusations against him were pure invention out of thin air. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower remains, on the actual historical evidence, deeply damning for him, regardless of who wrote the chronicles afterward. But it's worth holding two things in your head at once, because that's what honest history requires. Richard III's own actions in 1483 gave his enemies real, substantial material to work with. And the dynasty that killed him at Bosworth then spent the next century amplifying, shaping, and in places almost certainly exaggerating that material. Because a monstrous predecessor makes a shaky new dynasty look like a rescue rather than a coup. The truth about Richard III likely sits somewhere between the pantomime villain of legend and the wronged, misunderstood king that some of his modern defenders want him to be. And the fact that we still can't fully separate those two versions 5 centuries later tells you something about how completely the winners of Bosworth got to write the story. Step back now, all the way back, to the widest possible view, because the reason this particular battle still gets written about, still gets argued over, still gets dug up from underneath parking lots, is bigger than the 2 hours of fighting itself. Bosworth Field is widely treated by historians as the practical, symbolic endpoint of the English Middle Ages. The last time the English crown changed hands through the kind of raw, feudal, dynastic civil warfare that had defined the previous several hundred years, and the beginning of something recognizably closer to the early modern state. The Wars of the Roses, in the broadest sense, had been a decades-long argument about a fundamentally medieval question. Which noble bloodline has the better claim to sit on top of a system built around personal loyalty, private armies, and inherited land? Bosworth didn't just answer that argument for one specific family. It effectively ended the conditions that had made the argument possible in the first place. Because the Tudor state that emerged from it was built brick by brick, specifically to prevent any future version of the same fight. The centralization of royal authority that Henry VII pursued so methodically after Bosworth. Reigning in noble military power, rebuilding royal finances, tightening legal control over the aristocracy, laid groundwork that his son, Henry VIII, and later his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would build an entire early modern nation-state on top of. The break with Rome, the flourishing of Renaissance culture in England, the beginnings of English naval and commercial ambition that would eventually produce an empire. None of it happens the same way, or perhaps at all, if a different family had won that morning outside Leicester, or if the Stanleys had chosen differently, or if Richard's charge had covered those last desperate yards before William Stanley's men arrived. That's what makes the smallness of the actual battle so unsettling to sit with. Estimates of the total number of men actually killed at Bosworth are, by the standards of medieval warfare, relatively modest. Likely in the hundreds on Richard's side, a smaller number on Henry's. This was not a battle that redrew the map through sheer scale of slaughter the way some medieval engagements did. It was a battle that redrew 500 years of history through the outcome of maybe 2 hours of fighting on one wet field, decided in large part by a single family's timing. So come back one last time to the question this whole story has been circling. How does the stronger side lose? Not through some grand, inevitable historical current sweeping the wrong king away and the right one into place. History rarely works with that kind of tidy justice. And it certainly didn't work that way for the thousands of men who died across 3 decades of the Wars of the Roses so that this particular Tuesday in August could finally settle things. It happened because a king with every material advantage had never fully earned the trust his crown required. And because that missing trust left him exposed to exactly the kind of family that makes a habit of exploiting exposure. A family that had spent years learning to wait, to hedge, to commit to nothing until the last possible second, and then to strike decisively at precisely the moment their choice would matter more than any other choice made that day. Richard III wasn't defeated by Henry Tudor's army. Not really. Henry's army was smaller, weaker, and less experienced than his own. He was defeated by the space he had left open around himself over 2 years of ruling as a king whose own legitimacy he could never quite prove, and by his own final, desperate gamble to close that space by force. At the exact moment his uncertain allies decided they'd waited long enough to see which way to jump. The crown ended up in a hawthorn bush, then on Henry Tudor's head, then, generations later, sewn into the fabric of an English state that looked nothing like the one that existed the morning before the battle. And all of it traces back to 2 hours on a marshy field in Leicestershire, and one family that finally, after years of waiting, decided which way to fall. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone.